Well, it's Time Change Sunday, and these are one of those days that everything just feels a little bit slow. Did anybody have a hard time getting up this morning? Anybody stay up too late at the C of O basketball game and enjoying all that? Go Bobcats, that was really good, enjoyed all that. So I don't know about you, but these are kind of the days that make me want to drink coffee, and I'm not a coffee drinker. I kind of usually do hot tea. Does anybody drink hot tea in the morning? Is that good? Anybody need any hot tea this morning? You need some? All right, let's see if I can I'll just make a little hot tea here this morning. I mean, you deserve something for being here. Now, we are going to be concerned about fire safety today, so we got our fire stuff right here. But let's see if we can get some hot tea going, because I know people are a little thirsty. And let's see if I can plug this in. See if anything goes out when I turn this on. Let's see how that goes on. All right, that looks good. Anybody else need hot tea? Anybody need hot tea? All right, my wife needs hot tea. Well, let me make this hot tea first for her, and let's see. Let's get this going here. If anybody sees smoke at any time during the message, you feel free to wave your hand and point, okay? And I'll come back and take care of that. But we're going to make some hot tea for her. And then anybody else want hot tea? Anybody over here? All right. I'm going to take yours right here. I'm going to take your hot tea. I'm going to make you some hot tea. And I'm going to put this right over here, okay? All right. Well, many of you know a couple of weeks ago that in January, I went on a mission trip just recently to our church plant in San Francisco. And we had a great time in San Francisco. And I don't fly very often, and so when I fly, it's kind of a big deal. Now, some of you fly all of the time, and it's no big deal, but I kind of enjoy the whole experience of going to the airport and waiting, getting on the plane, and all the fun that goes on there. And we happen to fly with an airline that gives you free chocolate chip cookies. Now, I say free. After you buy a $500 ticket, they bring you a little cookie. And fortunately, on this mission trip, I had people who didn't like the chocolate chip cookies from our team, and so they would get their chocolate chip cookie and then give it to me, and then I would get my chocolate chip cookie, and it was just a great time because I love this airline because they happen to fly and they give you free chocolate chip cookies. In addition to that, this particular airline is known that they have a picture of an animal on the back of the plane. I don't know what you call that little pointy thing up at the side. I know the wings are these things that go this way, but then there's a thing that sticks up in the back. It's like this. Anybody know? So you don't know that either. Okay. Tail. All right, the tail. Thank you. All right. On the tail of the plane. And I was thinking, this is going to be kind of cool. I get chocolate chip cookies. And in addition to that, then I get to fly on a plane. And I'm thinking, you know what? This will be a really cool plane, like a leopard plane, or maybe it's going to be like a bear plane, or maybe if I'm lucky, it's going to be like the eagle plane, and this is going to be like the cool thing, and tell my kids, hey, I flew on the eagle plane. It was so great. Well, I get to the airport, and this is the animal that's on the back of my plane. And just to prove it to you, I'm not making this up, just to show you this is true, this is a picture taken of the plane that I'm riding, and I'm like, great, I get the ferret plane. This is really exciting. And so I asked the stewardess or the steward person or whatever, excuse me, I don't recognize that animal. What kind of animal is that? And they said, that's an ermine. And I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty impressive. And then I went home and looked it up, and that means white weasel is what that means. And so I'm flying on the weasel plane the one time a year that I get to fly, and I get to fly the weasel plane so I can come home and tell my kids, hey, Daddy flew on the weasel plane. Isn't that really exciting? And so they were really excited about that. But I thought about that. I guess there could be worse planes that you could be flying on. I mean, I guess there could be worse. There could be like flying on the cockroach plane. I guess that might be a little worse. Or if you're thinking about, let me make sure the tea's going because I know you're very concerned about that back over there. Yeah, that's coming along good. That might be bad, but if you're on a plane and you get a flightless bird as your mascot, like an ostrich or something like that, or an emu, that would be kind of bad. I just love that picture. I try to get it in as often as I can because it just says something to you. I don't know what it says to you. Like, get out of my face, I think is what it says. But then I guess it could be worse. It could be a pig plane, I guess, but that'd be kind of bad. But I guess if you're really in a hurry and you're busy, the worst kind of animal that could be on your plane would be the sloth. I don't know if you know much about sloths or not, but I've done a little research on sloths, and that's basically what they do most of the time. In fact, you may be related to somebody that looks kind of similar to that. So I knew that today was pretty exciting for you, and so what I've got for you, I got a little special. I'm going to show a little video of the sloth, okay? Pretty exciting, I know. Some of you are very, very excited. So I think they're going to try to get the video back there, and they're going to show you some video, hopefully, about the sloth, because this is some specialized footage of the sloth, because we actually caught one moving. And so this is like high-speed photography, and this happens to be the sloth. And I don't know if you know this about sloths or not, but they move so fast that algae actually grows on their fur. This is true. Algae grows on their fur, and sloths stay in the trees all week long. It takes 7 days for the sloth's food to digest. And so every 7 days he comes out of the trees because his food has digested. Do you understand why he's coming out of the tree once a week? Okay, that's why he's coming out of the tree. And they're one of the most amazing creatures because they have only 1/4 of the muscle mass as other animals of their size. And they're able, their stomachs are kind of like cow stomachs in the way they kind of process food. They basically, yeah, some of you are married to one of these guys, aren't you, right there? You know, he's just chilling out there and just looking around. They eat basically leaves. There's basically two kinds. There's the two-toed sloth, and then there's the three-toed sloth. In fact, they're pretty good decision makers, too. You can see how just definitive he is about making this choice to get into the water. Really, there's only one three-toed sloth that's in captivity because they only eat from one particular kind of tree. And so the sloth is one of the most admired little... Just can't make his mind up, you know, whether he should get in. Well, you know, that water can be cold, you know, and so you don't want to jump in there. Well, that's enough of the sloth video because people are rushing the stage with excitement on the sloth video. But you're probably wondering, Neil, why in the world are you showing a video of the sloth? Why are you talking about sloths? Well, when I was studying our passage today in the book of Romans, chapter 12, as we continue our series, I came to verse 11, and as I so oftentimes do, even though I use the NIV as kind of my base text, I will read other translations, and I happen to read in the English Standard Version today that it says, "Do not be slothful in zeal, but rather be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." Now notice what it says. It says, "Do not be slothful in zeal." Now, obviously, you know, we're not picking on the poor sloth who has, you know, this is his life, and that's the way it goes for him. He sleeps 10, 12, 15 hours a day, and he tries to spend all of his time very motionless in the treetop so that the other animals don't see to come and attack him. That's the reason he's very still. But it says, "Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord." And so when I looked at the NIV translation, it says this, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord." Now remember, we're in Romans chapter 12, and we are going verse by verse, and we are looking at and discovering these obligations that we're calling sweet obligations that we are to have in our lives in response to what we live in. The world that we live in, we are called to do and to be certain things. And in this passage, we are told now to not lack zeal. In fact, when you look at the original translation, it talks about this word zeal, which really means the will to accomplish something. It means the pursuit of achievement. It means the promoting or the accomplishing of some kind of task. And when you look at the passage, what it says is, in zeal or in diligence or in earnestness, not slothful. Now you notice the sloth, how he was kind of moving this morning, right? You know, how many of you woke up with a sloth in your house today and you were trying to get everybody to start moving, and they're moving kind of slow? Well, sometimes in our Christian walk, if we're not careful, we become slothful in our Christianity, and rather than pursuing an achievement or a goal or doing what we're supposed to be doing, we just kind of go through the motions. We just kind of begin to just walk through the thing. You know, Sunday morning here, it's going to be Sunday, and so I guess we've got to get up and go to church. And so you get up and you go to church. And the first thing that you think of on Sunday morning is, hey, great, I get a nap this afternoon. You know, that's the first thing that's in your mind. You're waking up and going, hey, this is a day that I can take a nap. And so I can take one while Neil's talking, and then I can take another one when I get home this afternoon. So it's a double nap time. And so sometimes we can approach our Christianity like that. We're just kind of going through the motions of church. We go to church on Sunday, and then we do small group at night, and maybe we're really spiritual and go on Wednesday night, or we drop the kids off to Awana and go to Walmart or whatever it is that you happen to do. And we do this Christian thing, and it becomes boring, and it becomes repetitive, and we just begin to move slothfully because sometimes church ends up being the most boring of events and boring of places. I mean, I'm boiling water, and you're excited about it, okay? That's kind of sorry to say that when we come to church and I boil water, and you're like, wow, he's boiling water. That's really cool. Okay, how exciting is that? we so easily slide into this Christianity of just going through the motions because nothing big is happening. There's no big problems. We're just going to move all those things. But in this passage, it says that we're not to do that. Now, here's the particular Greek word there for slothfulness. The word that is for sloth is really in this passage. And what it says is, for slothfulness, we are not to be slothful in our zeal. So you and I are called by God to accomplish something in our lives. Called to accomplish something as believers, called to accomplish something as church in order to do something. And I go to church after church after church, and it is a news bulletin that they're supposed to be doing something besides showing up for church. And if we're not careful in our own Christian life, that will happen to us. But God's calling for us is not to be slothful, but to have zeal, that if we're trying to accomplish something, we see a purpose, we see a task, and we're supposed to go for it, supposed to move for it. But this world's so let me say it this way. Have you ever tried to accomplish anything? And it seems like everything in the world is against you from accomplishing anything. Has that ever happened to you? You know, it's coming up soon, guys. We're going to mow the grass. And when we get ready to mow the grass, it's not going to be just a matter of mowing the grass. Number one, it's going to be about trying to find the lawnmower, and where do we put that, right? And then you're going to have to make sure that it's got gas and that it's got oil and that it's going to work. All of these things prevent us from accomplishing anything. And if that's true for just the simple things, it is so much more true for spiritual things. And so we begin to try something and it doesn't work, and we go, oh, well, you know, it's so hard to accomplish something, we're not even going to try anything. And in our Christianity, we have it so good in our country that we don't even work very hard. But what this passage calls us for is that we should not be slothful, because there's nothing beneficial about being slothful in our zeal. But it goes on to say something beyond that. It says, do not lack in zeal, but have spiritual fervency, or to be fervent in your spirit. What's interesting is that word for fervent is this word zontes. You know what that word means in the Greek? Take a wild guess. That word in the Greek means boiling. Isn't that interesting? Now, you know the three phases of matter, right? I mean, you were taught that, and somebody in school gave you a little ice cube, and it said the molecules in this ice cube are moving very, very slowly, right? You remember that? And then when it becomes a liquid, they say, hey, the molecules are moving faster in a liquid than they are in a solid. You remember this from science class? Did you go to science class? Did they have science class when you were there? And then when you provide energy for the molecules, and they move even faster and faster and faster. They move from being a solid to a liquid to what? Did you hear that? Yeah, I work very diligently to make all the timing on this kind of stuff work. Yeah, it works very hard. What you hear now are all those little atoms screaming for their lives is what you hear right now. No, that's not what you hear, but they move from moving very slow to faster to even faster. They move to this vapor stage, and then they begin to boil in a particular pot like this. Is designed so that as the little molecules are dying, they're screaming out in pain. No, that's not the way it works. They're constricted, and so they make this noise so that you and I know, because we might be too lazy to actually go check the water boiling, we can now hear that the water is boiling. Well, here's what's supposed to happen. In our spiritual fervency, we should be at a boil. But so often in our Christian life, it becomes so boring and so lackadaisical, so normal, that we are not boiling in our spirit, being moved, being energized, because all those little atoms are moving around really, really fast now. So the problem is, what causes us in our spirit to boil? Well, I want you to notice that I have two different tea kettles. And notice that one is boiling, but this one has yet to boil. Now, why is that? Because it is not near the heat source. Right? I promise you there's water in here, and if I jiggle it, you could hear it. Maybe in the front row you can hear it. And I know it's a different style, but it's still the same kind of process. But this is not boiling because it is far from the heat source. But here's what we oftentimes do as Christians. We go, okay, I'm going to get near the heat source, and I'm going to get nearer to the things of God. But if I don't turn this burner on, do you know how long it's going to take for this pot to boil? The same amount of time as it's going to take if it's over here. So we can get near something. See, here's what we think a lot of times. As long as I come to church, I am near other people who are boiling in their spirit. or I am near the environments that cause me to be that. And we think, we're close enough because we're going to church, or we're hanging out with people who are believers, or I'm in this one little Bible study, but I don't participate, I don't study, I'm just there. And somehow we think that we can boil in our spirit when that's not true. We have to put ourselves in relationship to the heat source, and if we're using the analogy here of our Christian walk, who is that heat source? Well, it's God himself. So what is it about God and his heart that could cause us to boil? Well, there's lots of places in the Scripture that tell us about God's heart. Because when we put ourselves individually in direct relationship with God's heart and the things that God cares about, then we naturally, our spirits spiritually will begin to boil, and we'll have this energy and we'll have this fervency. In fact, I was reading that I think it's the Chinese that have about 4 different words for boiling. They have a word that talks about just the little bubbles coming up, and then the medium bubbles, and then the torrent of bubbling. We're supposed to have our lives that we are involved in that, and our energy level as believers doing spiritual things should be high. So why is it not? Well, we separate ourselves from the heat source, from God. What is God concerned about? What can we get close to God's heart? Well, there's lots of places to look at it, but in Luke chapter 4, we see one time when Jesus really explains this. In Luke chapter 4, in about verse 18, we have the story of Jesus going back to his hometown, to his home church, his home synagogue, and it becomes his time to share the passage of Scripture. And what they would do in their synagogues is that they would read, the person would stand up and they would read a part of the Old Testament, and then they would sit down and they would teach. And so when Jesus begins his ministry back in his hometown, he reads this particular passage. And in this passage, I think, are 4 things that he identifies that are close to the heart of God, that if we align ourselves with, we're going to be aligned with the heat source for our own spiritualness, and so we can move out of the slothful nature and we can actually become boiling for him. Here's what he says. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Number 1. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, number 2, and recovery of sight for the blind, number 3. And then fourthly, he says to set the oppressed free. Now there's a 5th one that he doesn't quote from. That's from the Old Testament source that he's quoting from, and that is that the day of the vengeance of God has come. He leaves that one out because that's going to be his second coming, not his first coming. And then he says to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So here's the point. If you're feeling slothful today in your Christianity, if you will align yourself with these 4 things, it's like putting water on a heat source, and it will cause your spirit to become fervent, and it will cause your life to boil. What are they? 1, to proclaim good news to the poor. You see, as long as you are living a Christian life and you're separating yourself from God, you're isolating yourself from God, it doesn't matter how close you get to the heat source, if you don't put yourself in that relationship with God, you will never have that spiritual fervency. And here's what a lot of us do with the poor. We try to separate ourselves as far away as we can for the poor, because the poor are poor because they're making bad decisions, right? Maybe. But there's something about being in service to God by serving the poor that challenges us and that changes us. We have men's Bible study on Tuesdays. Have an early one, have a noon one, and have a late one. And we're at one of these, and this guy is so excited because he has just come back from a trip to Africa, and he's passing out like Tom's shoes. You know how Tom's shoes works, right? These are the shoes that kind of look like house shoes that I'm afraid to walk outside because I think they're just going to fall apart. But Jimmy bought me a pair so that I could be cool, and so I have a pair, and so I wear them. These are shoes that when you buy one, they give one to a needy country, a needy person. And so this guy's out there, and he's passing out shoes to these African people, and he spends 30 minutes talking about how incredible experience that is because he touched people who are lepers, and he's putting shoes on leprous feet, and he thinks this is the coolest thing in the world. And those of us who haven't done that look at him and go, that's a little odd. Right? Well, it's because you and I separate ourselves from the poor, and when you put yourself in connection with the poor, your heart changes and your life becomes energized. In addition to that, not just good news to the poor, but proclaiming freedom to the prisoners. We had a group that came just a couple of weeks ago, and they do prison ministry. They travel all across the country. Jack and Linda Purvis are in charge of that, and a guy named Curtis. And Curtis caught me right before lunch, and I was hungry. And Curtis is a big guy, 6'6", so I had to sit down and listen to him. And so he talked for about 30 minutes about going to this ministry, to Bill Glass Ministry, and how incredible it was, and he was spiritually fervent. But he's not just talking about here of these physical things. Because you know that there are people who are financially rich but spiritually poor. You know anybody like that? I mean, they can buy anything they want to in the world. And yet spiritually they're poor in life. Well, we have a calling to go minister to them and to love them. There are people who are in prison, but they're walking around every day, but they're in prison to some kind of addiction, or they're in prison to some kind of bad relationship. And we've got to go and proclaim spiritual freedom to them. And there are people who are blind, who don't understand the things of God, and we can go and share them, and maybe God will do something. And there are people that are oppressed, and we should go and present to them, proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. But when we remove ourselves from the things of God, our spiritual fervency goes down, and we become sloths. In fact, notice how quickly this happens. Notice this. You hear this whistling, right? You hear the whistling. You hear the steam. Watch it. Watch this. Do you see how quickly that stopped? Now I know the water's warm. I know that. But when you remove yourself from those things of the heart of God, so very quickly that spiritual fervency dies down. But watch this. When you put that back on to the heat source, do you see how quickly that changes again? And see, somehow we think that we were spiritual 5 years ago. And we walk some aisle, and we got spiritual for God, and then we take ourselves off that burner, and then we wonder why it is that we become slothful. Now, I know that water's going to stay warm for the next few minutes. I understand that. I know that. But it's very interesting to see how quickly that water cools down. And see, some of you used to be involved in church, and you used to be really involved in Bible study, and you were doing all those kind of things, but you've kind of set yourself aside, and you become a sloth spiritually. And you don't understand what's going on. What has to happen is you have to kind of move back to that fervency. And so today, maybe you don't feel real spiritual. Maybe you don't feel really excited for God. Maybe you've lost that energy. I tell you, if you put yourself in relationship with those four things, the blind, the oppressed, the ones that are in prison, the ones that are poor, not just physically, that is true, but if you do that spiritually, something will change in you. But as soon as you remove yourself from that, you lose that. And that's a constant battle that we face. In addition to that, there's one other thing in this passage, though. It's not just that we're supposed to be busy doing things. It's not just that we're supposed to be busy doing all of these things, involved in all those kind of things, but we're supposed to be doing that serving who? The Lord. Do you notice that in the passage? Never be lacking in zeal. Don't be slothful in whatever you approach, but keep your spiritual boiling, the Greek says. But you do that by serving the Lord. And here's an interesting word for serving. You probably don't recognize this word, but this is the word for serving, and it is basically the word for slaving. See, somehow you and I think that when we enter this relationship with God, it's kind of like a boss-employee deal. And when we get tired of working for the boss, or the boss is not nice to us, that we just quit. Or we just kind of walk away from that. Have you ever quit from a bad boss? I mean, there's some bad bosses out there, aren't there? And you sing a little Johnny Paycheck song to them as you walk out, right? You know, you do that. You say that to them and say, you can have this job, I don't care, right? But that's not the relationship that we have with God. We become slaves, and slaves don't get an option. I mean, if you were a slave and say, hey, I don't think I'm calling in sick today as a slave, what happens to that? Doesn't go well for you, does it? Well, we're supposed to be doing these things aimed toward God, serving God. So here's the whole point of the sermon. I've shown a video. I've boiled water on stage. What more must I do to show you how important this passage is? Right? Don't be a sloth. Get yourself back toward the heat source of where God is, the fervency of God's heart, and do that for Him, because that is your obligation. Do not be slothful in your zeal, in your diligence, in your earnestness, but be boiling in spirit, because you have connected to the heart of God as you serve the Lord. May God's people hear His calling. May they hear His voice. May they respond. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?